This podcast was recorded by Mark Peace for students at Manchester Metropolitan University. Please feel free to use it with appropriate citation under the terms of the Creative Commons licence. As educational practitioners, we're always in a state of flux, a state of becoming and rebecoming as we make sense of our contexts, our purposes, our principles and our ethics. We grapple with the complexities of real-life classrooms, confounded by those experiences that challenge or contradict our expectations. But teaching is an intellectually engaged activity, and as such we relish these challenges and the potentials for rediscovery and reinvention that they present. We celebrate that little bit of ourselves which isn't quite sure what kind of teacher we will be when we grow up, and the youthful hope that this uncertainty brings. So, we are in a state of constant being and becoming, but we do not do this in isolation. There is a context that surrounds us. We have entered a career of public service, and such a commitment involves recognition that what we do is a public good. And, as with any public good, debate rages over the purposes, intents, scope and legitimate outcomes of education. And the poles of this debate shape expectations of teachers and of teaching. In this podcast, I'm going to aim to give you a very brief and pit-stop tour of the shape of some of the broader politics which surround education, and an overview of some key ideologies. When we talk of ideology, we mean a coherent system of ideals and beliefs, a mythology which surrounds a particular reality, in this case schooling and education. Ideologies bring with them defaults and preferences. They establish what is normal and right, what is strange and unjust. They shape what is seen as legitimate in action, and what is heard as normal in language. Sometimes ideologies can be overwhelming. Not just perspectives, but seemingly undeniable truths, what we might perhaps otherwise call common sense in everyday language. The skill of the academic, though, is to disrupt these conventions, and to maintain that they offer only one window on the world. In the context of education, an ideology might be seen as an underlying set of principles and beliefs. It starts with a fundamental sense of what education is for, the purposes it should serve, and from this stem a whole range of implications about the relationship between learner and teacher, the nature of curriculum and appropriate pedagogy, the range and functions of assessment, the rules and rituals of the classroom and the very structure of the school system. All of these notions begin with an ideology, a sense of what schooling should do. In the Western context, the key poles of educational ideology have tended to be situated amongst the conflict between traditionalism and progressivism. These are two perspectives which have tussled for dominance in the last century, and the history of educational policy and practice can be typified in terms of a leaning towards one or the other. Given this prominence, it's with these two stances that I begin this exploration. As the name might suggest, traditionalist ideologies on education tend to allude to a classical sense of what it is to be a teacher and what it is to be a learner, an image of an historic formal classroom. A hallmark of this perspective is a sense that the teacher should be an unchallenged authority figure, something that surfaces across two key dimensions. Firstly, the perspective situates the teacher as an authority in terms of the content of lessons, a font of knowledge which might be transmitted into the pupils as passive recipients. Stemming from this notion is a strong sense of curriculum. Traditionalists argue that there exists a body of knowledge and understanding, the height of our cultural outputs, which all children should know. They emphasise facts and figures, for instance historic dates, and exposure to literature and scientific theory, sometimes to the extent of rote memorisation. A second dimension in the emphasis on authority in the traditionalist ideology is a focus on discipline. It highlights the importance of teachers instilling good behaviour and appropriate manners in their learners. Often this perspective alludes to a loss of this strictness in schools in explaining wider social ills such as crime. Finally, a traditionalist approach sees education as providing a sorting and sifting function, identifying the most talented and able learners, allowing them to rise to the top so that they might be allocated to socially important jobs. It sees examinations and formal tests as the most effective approach to realising this. Where the traditionalist ideology on education sees schooling as a process of filling the learner with external knowledges and behavioural patterns, the progressive approach is more focused on what the learner themselves can develop and contribute. As such, It has an emphasis on curriculums which are developed on the basis of the learner's interests, ideas or cultures, or organises them thematically. It emphasises skills and competencies over knowledge and recall, and sees a deep and involved understanding as more important than any rote or surface recall. The progressive approach to education sees the outcomes of schooling as more varied than academic achievement, suggesting that promoting tolerance and equality and other broader social benefits are equally valid. As such, its assessment processes are more creative and innovative and less reliant on recall in examination. This key divide between traditionalism and progressivism has shaped educational policy over the past century, and has also influenced some of the language we use to talk about pedagogy. In particular, the notion of teacher and student-centred approaches have strong connections to these underlying ideological perspectives. This isn't, however, the only typology of perspectives. Elsewhere, 5 slightly more subtle approaches have been identified. Classical humanism in this approach is the closest to traditionalism. It suggests that education should maintain society by transmitting a core of important knowledge, understanding and behaviours, reproducing culture as it currently exists. Liberal humanism offers a more person-centred ideology. Here, a traditional curriculum is still emphasised, as in classical humanism, but it's drawn upon to promote social change and social mobility, to allow people to reach their full individual potentials. In the usual sense, progressivism refers to an ideology that takes liberal humanism to the next extent, removing the emphasis on curriculum and instead focusing on the learner, on their emerging interests, capacities and capabilities. Instrumentalism is an ideology that places emphasis on the vocational outcomes of education, and the importance of meeting the needs of business and the economy, such as functional literacy and numeracy. Finally, reconstructivism is the most radical perspective. It emphasises the role of education in promoting social change, and the possibility of classrooms which interrogate inequalities and power relations in order to produce learners who are activists, set to make the world a better place. There are then a range of educational ideologies, each bringing a different emphasis to the purpose of education, and each constructing the role of the teacher in a different way. And the teacher, in their process of discovery and rediscovery, navigates them as they occur in both overt and subtle ways. We're consciously and unconsciously encountering, accepting and rejecting them in our daily practices. The challenge now remains to render these overt, in order to better understand what we do in the classroom,